The hurricane wind screamed through downtown Millfield like a banshee, hurling debris through the air as floodwaters surged down Main Street. Through the chaos, Ronel Clark spotted her, the woman who had destroyed his life just 6 days ago, clinging desperately to the roof of her overturned luxury sedan, her designer heels long gone, her perfectly styled hair now plastered against her face by the relentless rain. "Help me!" Evelyn Cross screamed over the roar of Hurricane Helena, her voice cracking with terror as the water rose around her expensive car. "Please, somebody help me!" The irony wasn't lost on Ronel as he fought against the current, his work boots finding purchase on the submerged sidewalk. 6 days ago, this same woman had sat behind her mahogany desk in the penthouse of Cross Industries, her cold blue eyes showing no emotion as she handed him a pink slip and destroyed his daughter's future with 3 simple words: "You're terminated, effective immediately." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ronel Clark had been the best maintenance supervisor Cross Industries had ever employed. For 4 years, he'd kept their vast network of luxury hotels running smoothly, working double shifts when necessary, never missing a day, even when 8-year-old Lily was sick. The single father had built his entire life around that job, not just for the decent salary, but for the health insurance that kept his daughter alive. Lily had been born with a rare heart condition that required constant monitoring and would eventually need a $200,000 surgery that no parent should ever have to worry about affording. But Ronel never worried because Cross Industries had excellent benefits, and he was the kind of employee any company would be lucky to have. That security had crumbled in Evelyn Cross's office last Tuesday morning. She hadn't even looked up from her tablet when he'd knocked on her door, responding to an urgent summons from Human Resources. Her assistant, a nervous young man named Tyler, had ushered Ronel into the chrome and glass sanctuary where Evelyn Cross ruled her billion-dollar empire with ruthless efficiency. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Millfield's skyline, a constant reminder of the power she wielded over the lives of thousands of employees. "Mr. Thompson," she had said, finally gracing him with her attention, her voice carrying the kind of practiced indifference that came from firing people on a regular basis. "We're restructuring our facilities management division. Your position has been eliminated." The words had hit Ronel like a physical blow. Cross Industries was expanding, not contracting. They'd just announced record profits and were breaking ground on 3 new properties. "Ma'am, I don't understand," he'd said, his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. "My performance reviews have always been excellent. I've saved the company hundreds of thousands in maintenance costs. Just last month, I prevented a major HVAC failure that could have—" "The decision is final," Evelyn had interrupted, her manicured fingers drumming impatiently on her desk. She slid a manila envelope across the polished surface without making eye contact. "Security will escort you out. Your benefits will terminate at the end of this week." Ronel had stared at the envelope, his mind racing through the implications. Lily's next cardiology appointment was in 2 weeks. Her surgery was scheduled for next month. Without insurance, they would lose everything, not just their financial security, but potentially Lily's life. "Please," he had said, the words scraping his throat raw, "my daughter has a heart condition. She needs surgery next month. Without the insurance—" "I'm sorry to hear about your daughter's condition," Evelyn had replied, though her tone suggested she was anything but sorry. "Human Resources will provide COBRA information. The meeting is over." She had stood then, dismissing him with the casual cruelty of someone who had never faced a day of uncertainty in her privileged life. Ronel had wanted to tell her exactly what he thought of her and her heartless corporate machine, but he'd bitten his tongue. Burning bridges wouldn't help Lily, and there was always a chance, however slim, that he might need something from Cross Industries in the future. So he'd taken the envelope, nodded politely, and walked out of her office with his dignity intact, even as his world crumbled around him. The security escort was particularly humiliating. 20 years of honest work, 4 years of dedicated service to Cross Industries, and he'd been marched out like a common criminal while his former colleagues watched in uncomfortable silence. Word traveled fast in a company like Cross Industries, and by the time Ronel reached the parking garage, everyone knew that Evelyn Cross had personally overseen his termination. Now, 6 days later, as Hurricane Helena tore through Millfield with unprecedented fury, Ronel found himself face to face with the woman who had shown him no mercy. The storm had turned the downtown business district into a war zone, with winds exceeding 140 miles per hour and a storm surge that had overwhelmed the city's flood defenses. Emergency services were completely overwhelmed, and most of the downtown area had been evacuated hours ago. But Ronel hadn't evacuated. He'd been at Millfield General Hospital with Lily, trying to negotiate a payment plan for her upcoming surgery when the storm hit with unexpected intensity. The hurricane had shifted course at the last minute, making landfall directly over their city instead of passing harmlessly offshore as predicted. By the time Ronel realized the danger, the roads were already impassable, and he'd made the desperate decision to try to reach higher ground on foot.
That's when he'd seen Evelyn Cross's silver Mercedes spinning through the intersection like a toy, caught in a surge of floodwater that had turned Main Street into a raging river. The car had flipped twice before coming to rest upside down against a concrete barrier, water pouring through the broken windows. Any rational person would have left her there. After what she'd done to him and Lily, Ronel would have been justified in walking away and letting karma run its course. But as he watched Evelyn struggle against the rising water, clinging to the car's undercarriage with desperate fingers, Ronel knew he couldn't live with himself if he didn't try to help. "Hold on!" he shouted, pushing through the chest-deep water toward her overturned vehicle. "I'm coming!" Evelyn's eyes widened with recognition as he approached, and for a moment, something flickered across her face. Shame, perhaps, or the dawning realization that her life now depended on the man she'd callously discarded less than a week ago. "Ronel!" she gasped, her voice barely audible over the storm. You came back for me!" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications neither was ready to examine. Ronel didn't answer immediately, focusing instead on the immediate problem of getting them both to safety before the next surge swept them away. But as he reached for Evelyn's outstretched hand, he couldn't help but wonder if this was fate's way of evening the score, or simply the cruel irony of a universe that delighted in testing people's capacity for forgiveness. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 6 days earlier, Ronel Clark had awakened to what he thought would be an ordinary Tuesday morning. The alarm clock buzzed at 5:30 a.m., just as it had every weekday for the past 4 years. In the next room, 8-year-old Lily was still sleeping peacefully, her breathing steady and strong, a sound that never failed to fill Ronel with gratitude. The heart monitor beside her bed displayed normal rhythms, its soft green glow a constant reminder of how fragile and precious life could be. Ronel moved quietly through their modest 2-bedroom apartment in Riverside Heights, a working-class neighborhood about 20 minutes from downtown Millfield. The apartment wasn't much: thin walls, outdated appliances, and a leaky faucet he'd been meaning to fix for months. But it was home. More importantly, it was affordable on his supervisor's salary, leaving enough money to cover Lily's medical expenses and set aside small amounts for her future surgery. He'd gotten the maintenance supervisor position at Cross Industries through a combination of hard work, technical expertise, and sheer determination. 20 years in various maintenance roles had taught him everything about keeping buildings running efficiently. He could diagnose HVAC problems by sound alone, spot electrical issues before they became dangerous, and manage a team of technicians with the kind of quiet authority that came from genuine competence rather than corporate politics. Cross Industries had been different from his previous employers. The company's portfolio of luxury hotels and commercial properties demanded the highest standards, but they also offered benefits that most blue-collar workers could only dream of. Full medical coverage, dental, vision, and a retirement plan that actually meant something. For a single father raising a child with complex medical needs, It had seemed like a miracle. Lily had been born with hypoplastic left heart syndrome, a condition where the left side of her heart was severely underdeveloped. She'd already undergone 2 major surgeries in her short life, with a third and final procedure scheduled for next month. The Fontan completion, Dr. Patricia Hendrickson explained, would essentially reroute her blood flow to work with her single-functioning ventricle. It was complex, expensive, and absolutely necessary for Lily to have anything approaching a normal life. The surgery would cost $200,000, not including the extended hospital stay and follow-up care. Without insurance, it might as well have cost $1 million. But Ronel had never worried about the money, because Cross Industries' insurance was excellent and his job was secure. His performance reviews had been outstanding, his team respected him, and he'd saved the company hundreds of thousands of dollars through preventative maintenance and innovative solutions. That security had made him perhaps too comfortable, too trusting in the corporate machine that employed him. He'd assumed that competence and dedication would be enough to protect him, that a company like Cross Industries, built on reputation and quality, would value employees who embodied those same principles. He'd been wrong. The call from Human Resources had come just after 9 a.m., while Ronel was reviewing the quarterly maintenance reports for the Grandview Hotel, Cross Industries' flagship property. "Mr. Clark?" The voice on the phone had been professionally neutral. "Miss Cross would like to see you in her office, immediately." The tone had set off alarm bells, but Ronel had assumed it was about the upcoming renovations at the West Side property, or perhaps recognition for his team's excellent safety record. Cross Industries occupied 3 floors of the Sterling Tower, the gleaming steel and glass monument to corporate success that dominated Millfield's skyline. Ronel had been to the executive floor only twice before, once during his initial interview 4 years ago, and once to receive a safety award. The elevator ride to the 30th floor had felt longer than usual, and he'd noticed his reflection in the polished steel doors, taking inventory of his appearance. Clean work shirt, pressed pants, and steel-toed boots that had seen better days but were still professional. He looked like what he was, a working man who took pride in his job.
Evelyn Cross's office had been a study in intimidation, designed to remind visitors of the vast gulf between executive power and everyone else. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the city below, while modern art that probably cost more than Ronel's annual salary adorned the walls. The desk itself was a massive slab of polished mahogany, positioned to force visitors to approach like supplicants seeking an audience with royalty. Tyler Brennan, Miss Cross's assistant, had escorted Ronel through the marble-floored reception area with obvious discomfort. Tyler was young, maybe 25, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he was perpetually afraid of making a mistake that would cost him his job. She's been in meetings all morning," Tyler had whispered as they approached the office doors. "Corporate restructuring stuff. I probably shouldn't say anything, but—" He'd trailed off, shaking his head. Evelyn Cross had been on a phone call when they entered, speaking in clipped, authoritative tones about quarterly projections and market expansion. She gestured for Ronel to sit without looking up, continuing her conversation for another 3 minutes while he waited in increasingly uncomfortable silence. When she'd finally ended the call and given her attention, her expression had been completely neutral, not hostile, not friendly, just professionally blank in a way that somehow felt worse than outright anger. "Mr. Clark," she'd said, consulting a tablet that presumably contained his personnel file. "Thank you for coming up. I'll get straight to the point. Cross Industries is undergoing a comprehensive restructuring of our facilities management operations. We're consolidating several positions and implementing new efficiency protocols." The corporate speak had been polished and impersonal, but Ronel had immediately understood what was coming. He'd seen enough layoffs over the years to recognize the script. Still, he'd held on to hope that this was about a transfer or perhaps a reorganization that would actually strengthen his position. "Your position as maintenance supervisor is being eliminated, effective immediately," she'd continued, sliding a manila envelope across the desk with practiced efficiency. "We appreciate your years of service to Cross Industries, and Human Resources will provide you with information about severance and COBRA benefits." The words had hit Ronel like a physical blow, leaving him momentarily speechless. Cross Industries was expanding rapidly, opening 2 new properties this year and acquiring 3 more. The maintenance demands were growing, not shrinking. His team was already stretched thin managing the existing portfolio. The restructuring made no sense from an operational standpoint. "Ma'am, I need to understand this," he'd said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "My performance reviews have been excellent. My team has the best safety record in the company. We've consistently come in under budget while maintaining the highest standards. Just last quarter, we prevented a major HVAC failure at the Grand View that could have cost the company millions in damages and lost revenue." Evelyn's expression hadn't changed. "The decision is based on overall corporate strategy, not individual performance metrics. The restructuring affects multiple positions across various departments." But Ronel knew this wasn't some across-the-board cost-cutting measure. Cross Industries had just announced record profits for the 3rd consecutive year. Executive bonuses had been substantial, and the company was actively hiring in other departments. This was personal, though he couldn't understand why. "My daughter has a serious heart condition," he'd said, abandoning pride in favor of desperation. "She needs surgery next month. The insurance coverage through Cross Industries is the only way we can afford the procedure. Without it, I don't know what we'll do." For the first time during the meeting, something had flickered in Evelyn's eyes. Not compassion exactly, but perhaps a brief moment of discomfort with the human cost of her decision. It had passed quickly, replaced by the same professional detachment. "I'm sorry to hear about your daughter's condition," she'd said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "Human Resources will provide you with information about continuing your coverage through Cobra. The meeting is concluded." She'd stood then, a clear dismissal that left no room for further discussion or appeal. Ronel had wanted to argue, to demand an explanation that made sense, to point out the injustice of destroying a man's livelihood and his child's future without cause. But he'd recognized the futility of reasoning with someone who viewed employees as expendable resources rather than human beings. Instead, he'd taken the envelope, nodded politely, and walked out of her office with whatever dignity he could salvage. The security escort had been the final humiliation, being marched through the building like a criminal while former colleagues averting their eyes in uncomfortable silence. 4 years of dedicated service reduced to a cardboard box of personal items and a pink slip. As Ronel had driven home that afternoon, his mind raced through impossible calculations. Cobra would cost nearly $800 a month for family coverage, money he didn't have and couldn't afford on unemployment benefits. The surgery was scheduled for November 15th, just 5 weeks away. Dr. Hendricks had been clear that delaying the procedure wasn't an option. Lily's condition was deteriorating and waiting could be fatal. He'd sat in his car outside their apartment building for 20 minutes, trying to figure out how to tell his 8-year-old daughter that the surgery that would save her life might not happen because her father had been fired for reasons he didn't understand. The conversation had been one of the hardest things he'd ever had to do, watching Lily's bright smile fade as she processed the implications of what he was telling her. "It's okay, Daddy," she said finally, with the kind of wisdom that children sometimes develop when they faced more medical challenges than most adults. "Maybe the doctors can wait a little longer. Maybe you'll find another job with good insurance."
But they both knew there wasn't time for maybe. And now, 6 days later, as Ronel fought against hurricane winds to reach the woman who had destroyed their lives, he couldn't help but wonder if this was some twisted form of cosmic justice, or simply another cruel twist in a story that seemed determined to test every ounce of strength and forgiveness he possessed. The floodwater was rising faster than either of them had anticipated. Ronel grabbed Evelyn's wrist just as another surge crashed over the overturned Mercedes, threatening to tear her away from the vehicle entirely. Her expensive silk blouse was torn and soaked through, her perfectly manicured nails now broken and bleeding from clinging to the jagged metal of the car's undercarriage. "I can't hold on much longer," she gasped, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. The storm surge had turned downtown Millfield into a deadly maze of debris and rushing water, with abandoned vehicles bobbing like toys in the current. street signs bent at impossible angles, and the roar of wind through the skyscrapers created an otherworldly symphony of destruction. Ronel assessed their situation with the quick, practical thinking that had made him an excellent maintenance supervisor. The Mercedes was wedged against a concrete traffic barrier, but the position was precarious. The next major surge would likely dislodge it completely, sending both the car and anyone clinging to it into the deeper water of what used to be Fifth Avenue. They had maybe 5 minutes before that happened. "Listen to me carefully," he shouted over the storm, his grip on her wrist tightening. "I'm going to pull you toward me, but you need to let go of the car when I say. There's a loading dock about 50 yards upstream. If we can reach it, we'll be above the flood line." Evelyn's eyes were wide with terror, but she nodded. This was clearly the first time in her privileged life that she'd faced a situation that couldn't be solved with money or corporate authority. The woman who commanded boardrooms and intimidated executives was now completely dependent on the competence of a man she'd fired without cause. "On 3, Ronel called out. 1, 2, 3! Evelyn released her death grip on the car, and Ronel immediately pulled her toward him, wrapping his arm around her waist as they were both swept into the current. The water was shockingly cold and incredibly powerful, filled with debris that turned every piece of floating wood or metal into a potential weapon. Ronel kicked hard, using his work boots to find purchase against submerged cars and street fixtures, fighting to angle their trajectory toward the loading dock he'd spotted. 20 years of physical labor had given Ronel the kind of functional strength that came from real work rather than gym workouts. His shoulders and back ached from the effort of fighting the current while supporting Evelyn's weight, but he pushed through the pain. Beside him, she was struggling to stay afloat, clearly not a strong swimmer and hampered by her restrictive business attire. A piece of debris, part of a storefront awning, came spinning toward them with deadly force. Ronel saw it at the last second and twisted his body to shield Evelyn, taking the impact on his shoulder. The blow sent a spike of pain down his arm, but he maintained his grip on her, continuing to fight toward the dock. "Almost there," he panted, though the effort was taking everything he had. The loading dock was maybe 20 yards away now, but the current was trying to sweep them past it toward the deeper water where Main Street disappeared into what looked like a raging river. With a final desperate effort, Ronel lunged for the concrete edge of the loading dock, his fingers finding purchase on the wet surface. He hauled himself up just enough to hook his elbow over the edge, then reached down to grab Evelyn under the arms, pulling her up behind him. They collapsed onto the concrete platform, both gasping and shaking from the cold and adrenaline. For several minutes, they lay there in silence, catching their breath and processing what had just happened. The loading dock was about 8 feet above the current flood level, giving them temporary safety, but a clear view of the destruction below. Downtown Millfield looked like a war zone, with emergency lights flashing in the distance and the occasional sound of sirens barely audible over the wind. "Thank you," Evelyn said finally, her voice small and shaken. She was sitting with her back against the brick wall of the building, her arms wrapped around her knees. Without her usual armor of expensive clothes and executive authority, she looked younger, more vulnerable, almost like a different person entirely. Ronel didn't respond immediately. He was examining a cut on his forearm from the debris impact, using his shirt to apply pressure to the bleeding. The practical part of his mind was already assessing their next challenge. They were temporarily safe from the floodwater, but still trapped in the middle of a Category 4 hurricane with no way to communicate with emergency services. "My phone's dead," Evelyn said, apparently following his thoughts. She was trying to restart her water-damaged iPhone with no success. "The water must have fried it completely." "Mine too," Ronel confirmed, checking his basic flip phone, the only model he could afford on his limited budget. "Even if they were working, cell towers are probably down. We're on our own until this storm passes." The reality of their situation was settling in. Hurricane Helena was expected to maintain dangerous winds for at least another 6 hours, with the storm surge continuing long after that. Emergency services would be completely overwhelmed, focused on life-threatening rescues in the areas that had been evacuated properly. No one would be looking for them in downtown Millfield, because no one was supposed to be here.
"How long before we can get out of here?" Evelyn asked, and Ronel could hear the edge of panic creeping into her voice. This was a woman accustomed to controlling every aspect of her environment, and the helplessness of their situation was clearly overwhelming her. "Depends on how fast the water recedes," Ronel said honestly. "Could be hours, could be tomorrow morning. We need to find better shelter and figure out how to signal for help when rescue teams start operating again." He was already thinking like the problem solver he always been, mentally cataloging their resources and options. The loading dock connected to what appeared to be a warehouse or distribution center. If they could get inside, they might find supplies, communication equipment, or at least a way to get to higher ground. "There," he said, pointing to a service door about 20 feet along the platform. "That might be our way in. These commercial buildings usually have emergency supplies, maybe even a landline phone." Ronel nodded, struggling to her feet on shaking legs. Her expensive heels were long gone, lost in the floodwater, and she was trying to walk on bare feet across the rough concrete. Ronel noticed her difficulty and, after a moment's hesitation, offered his arm for support. "I can manage," she said automatically, the reflex of someone who never showed weakness or accepted help from subordinates. "I know you can," Ronel replied calmly, "but there's no point in making this harder than it has to be." She looked at him for a long moment, perhaps realizing that the normal rules and hierarchies that governed their previous relationship were meaningless in their current situation. Finally, she accepted his support, leaning on his arm as they made their way toward the service door. The door was locked, but Ronel had expected that. 20 years in maintenance had taught him how to deal with various types of commercial locks, and this was a standard deadbolt that could be bypassed with the right tools. He pulled out his multi-tool, one of the few possessions that had survived their swim through the floodwater, and went to work on the lock mechanism. "Is this illegal?" Evelyn asked nervously as he manipulated the lock components. "It's survival," Ronel said simply. "I'll leave a note explaining the emergency entry and offer to pay for any damages. Most property owners are understanding about life-threatening situations." The lock clicked open after a few minutes of careful work, and they stepped into the dark interior of what appeared to be a warehouse or distribution center. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows among the stacked sofas and dining room sets, but the building felt solid and dry, a vast improvement over their exposed position on the loading dock. "Stay close," Ronel warned, as they moved deeper into the warehouse. As they explored their temporary refuge, Ronel found himself studying Evelyn in this new context. Without her corporate armor, with her hair disheveled and her clothes torn, she seemed more human somehow. The imperious executive who had fired him was still there, but so was something else: vulnerability, maybe even fear. It was the first time he'd seen her as anything other than the embodiment of corporate power, and it was strangely unsettling. They found an office area near the front of the building, complete with a desk phone that still had a dial tone, but when Ronel tried calling 911, he got only busy signals. The emergency services were completely overwhelmed. He tried the non-emergency police line, the hospital, even the Cross Industries emergency number, but everything was either busy or not responding. "We're really on our own," he said, hanging up the phone after the latest failed attempt. Evelyn was sitting in the office chair, staring out the window at the storm still raging outside. "I should have evacuated yesterday," she said quietly. "Tyler kept telling me to leave, but I had that conference call with the Singapore investors. I thought the storm would miss us, like they always do." It was perhaps the first time he'd heard her admit to making a mistake, and certainly the first time she acknowledged that someone else, her assistant Tyler, had given her good advice. In the corporate world they'd both inhabited, such admissions were rare and potentially dangerous. "We all make decisions based on the information we have," Ronel said diplomatically. "No one expected the storm to shift course so dramatically." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind howl around the building and watching debris fly past the windows. The immediate crisis of getting to safety was over, but they both understood that their ordeal was far from finished. They were trapped together, the executive and the employee, the woman who had fired him and the man who had saved her life, waiting for a storm to pass and wondering what would happen when the normal world returned. The warehouse emergency lighting cast long shadows as Ronel systematically explored their temporary shelter, his practical mind cataloging every resource that might help them survive the next several hours.
while Evelyn remained in the office chair, shivering in her wet clothes and looking increasingly uncomfortable as the reality of their situation settled in. "We need to get you into dry clothes," Ronel said, returning from his reconnaissance of the building. "Hypothermia is a real risk, and that silk blouse isn't doing you any favors." He'd found a break room with vending machines and a lost-and-found box that might contain something useful. Evelyn looked down at her ruined outfit, the designer blouse that probably cost more than most people make in a week, now torn and stained with floodwater. "She don't suppose this place has a boutique?" she said with bitter humor, the first hint of levity she'd shown since he'd pulled her from the water.
"No boutique," Ronel replied, "but there's a lost-and-found box with some employee clothing. It's not going to be designer quality, but it'll be dry and warm." He paused, watching her process this information. "Your choice. You can stay in those wet clothes and risk getting sick, or you can swallow your pride and wear something practical." The old Evelyn, the corporate executive who ruled from her ivory tower, might have refused on principle. But this version, stripped of her usual power and faced with genuine physical discomfort, was learning to be pragmatic. "Show me what you found," she said, standing up with visible effort. Ronel led her to the break room, where he'd laid out his discoveries on a plastic table, a janitor's coverall that looked like it might fit, a t-shirt with the warehouse logo, and a pair of work boots that were only slightly too large. It wasn't glamorous, but it was functional. "I'll give you some privacy," Ronel said, starting to leave the room. "There's a first aid kit in the office if you need to clean any cuts." "Wait," Evelyn called out, her voice uncertain. "What about you? Your clothes are just as wet." Ronel looked down at his work shirt and pants, both soaked through and probably ruined. "I found another coverall that should work. I'll change after you're done." He was already thinking ahead to their other needs: food, water, warmth, and most importantly, a way to signal for help when the storm passed. 20 minutes later, they reconvened in the office area, both transformed by their practical new attire. Evelyn, in the navy coverall, looked almost unrecognizable. Younger, somehow, less intimidating, more approachable. The expensive jewelry was gone, either lost in the flood or removed for safety, and her usual perfect makeup had been washed away by the storm. "Better?" Ronel asked, noting that she'd stopped shivering and seemed more alert. "Much," she admitted. "I'd forgotten what it felt like to be genuinely cold and wet. It's been a long time since I've had to worry about basic physical comfort." The admission was telling, a glimpse into a life so insulated by wealth and privilege that even minor discomfort had become foreign. Ronel found himself wondering when she'd last faced any real adversity, any situation where money couldn't solve the problem instantly. "Now we focus on the essentials," Ronel said, pulling out a notepad he'd found in the desk drawer. "Water, food, communication, and shelter improvement. The building seems structurally sound, but we should identify the safest areas in case the storm gets worse." He'd already been thinking like the maintenance supervisor he was, assessing their environment with professional eyes. The warehouse was well built, with reinforced walls and a modern electrical system. The emergency lighting was connected to backup batteries that should last for hours, and there was even a generator in the basement, though he'd need to check if it had fuel. "You're very organized about this," Evelyn observed, watching him make systematic notes about their situation. "Is this something you learned in the military?" "Never served, just 20 years of fixing problems for other people. You learn to break complex situations down into manageable pieces, prioritize what's critical, and work through the list." He looked up from his notes. "What about you? Any experience with emergency situations?" Evelyn laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The closest I've come to an emergency is when the catering was late for a board meeting. This is," she gestured around the warehouse, "completely outside my experience." It was another admission of vulnerability, another crack in the facade of corporate competence. Ronel found himself reassessing his opinion of her, recognizing that her success in business didn't necessarily translate to practical life skills. She was intelligent, obviously, but intelligence without experience was of limited use in their current situation. "That's okay," he said. "Different people have different strengths. Right now we need practical skills more than business strategy,
but that doesn't make you useless." Evelyn studied his face, perhaps surprised by his matter-of-fact acceptance of their reversed roles. In the corporate world, admitting incompetence was career suicide. Here, it was simply reality that needed to be acknowledged and worked around. "What can I do to help?" she asked, and she could hear the effort it took for her to put herself in a subordinate position. "Help me inventory what we have," he said, handing her a section of his notes. "Check the vending machines, see if any of them are working. Look for anything that might be useful. Tools, supplies, emergency equipment. This is a commercial building, so there should be safety equipment somewhere." As they worked together, Ronel noticed how Evelyn approached even these simple tasks with the same systematic thinking she probably used in business. She didn't just check the vending machines, she documented what was available, calculated how long the supplies might last, and even figured out how to get the change machine to work so they could access the food without breaking anything. "Impressive," Ronel said, when she showed him her detailed inventory. "You've got a good analytical mind." "Thanks," she replied, and he could tell the compliment meant something to her. "I've never really had to apply it to survival situations before." They found more than Ronel had hoped for. The warehouse had a well-stocked first aid kit, emergency water supplies, and even some camping equipment that appeared to be destined for retail sale. There was a battery-powered radio, though it was only picking up emergency broadcasts that confirmed what they already knew. The storm was unprecedented, downtown was completely flooded, and rescue operations wouldn't begin until the weather cleared.
"Listen to this," Evelyn said, adjusting the radio antenna. The emergency broadcaster was reading a list of evacuation centers and emergency phone numbers, but also something that made both of them pay closer attention. Cross Industries has established an emergency fund to assist displaced employees and their families. CEO Evelyn Cross, who was reportedly trapped in the downtown area during the storm, has authorized unlimited resources for emergency services and temporary housing. Evelyn's face went pale as she listened to the report. "They think I'm missing," she said quietly. "Tyler must have reported that I never made it home yesterday." "Are you surprised?" Ronel asked. "You were supposed to evacuate with everyone else." "I suppose not," she replied, but something in her expression suggested the report had affected her more than she was letting on. "It's strange. Hearing about yourself in the past tense makes you realize how expendable we all are." Ronel looked at her carefully. The woman who had fired him without a second thought was contemplating her own mortality, perhaps for the first time. It was humanizing in a way that made him uncomfortable. It was easier to resent someone when you could think of them as purely heartless. "You're not expendable," he said finally. "Difficult, maybe. Frustrating, definitely. But not expendable." She looked up at him with surprise. "Even after what I did to you? After I fired you and put your daughter's health at risk?" It was the first time she directly acknowledged the harm she had caused, and Ronel could see that the admission cost her something. In her world, apologies were signs of weakness, admissions of guilt that could be used against you. "Even then," he said simply, "I don't like what you did, and I don't understand why you did it, but that doesn't mean I'd leave you to drown." They were quiet for a moment, the weight of unspoken questions hanging between them. The radio continued its loop of emergency information, but the reports were becoming repetitive. Hurricane Helena was still battering the coast with devastating force, and emergency services remained suspended until conditions improved. They were settling in for what would clearly be a long night together. "Tell me about Lily," Evelyn said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence they had fallen into while sharing a package of crackers from the vending machine. "Your daughter. What's she like?" The question caught Ronel off guard. In all their previous interactions, brief as they had been, Evelyn had never shown any interest in his personal life. Employees were just resources to be managed, not people with families and stories. "She's 8, he said carefully, unsure how much to share. "Smart as a whip, loves to read, has more courage than most adults I know.
He paused, then added, "She's been through medical procedures than any kid should have to endure, but she never complains, never feels sorry for herself." "The heart condition you mentioned, how serious is it?" Ronel studied her face, looking for signs of polite corporate interest rather than genuine concern, but her expression seemed sincere, and something about their isolation and shared vulnerability made honest conversation feel safer than it normally would. "Hypoplastic left heart syndrome," he said. "She was born with only half a functioning heart. She's already had 2 major surgeries, and there's one more, the final one, scheduled for next month." He met her eyes directly, or was scheduled, before I lost my insurance. Evelyn flinched slightly at the reminder of her role in his firing. "What happens if she doesn't get the surgery?" "Her condition deteriorates," Ronel said bluntly. "The doctors have been very clear about the timeline. This isn't something we can postpone indefinitely." They sat quietly for a moment, the weight of that reality settling between them. Outside, the wind continued to howl, rattling the warehouse walls and reminding them of the forces beyond their control. "I have a question," Ronel said finally. "Why did you fire me? And don't give me the corporate restructuring line. We both know that wasn't the real reason." Evelyn was quiet for so long that Ronel thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because you reminded me of someone," she said. "Someone I've been trying very hard to forget." "Who?" Another long pause. Evelyn pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them in a gesture that made her look much younger than her 34 years. "My father," she said finally. "Your work ethic, your dedication to your family, the way you never complained even when you were working impossible hours, you reminded me of him, and I couldn't handle that." Ronel waited, sensing there was more to the story. Evelyn was staring out the window at the storm, but he could tell she was seeing something else entirely. "He was a maintenance worker too. Industrial facilities mostly. Power plants, manufacturing complexes. He worked constantly, always taking extra shifts to provide for us. My mother died when I was 12, and it was just the 2 of us after that. He did everything. Worked 2 jobs, helped with homework, came to every school event even when he was exhausted." "Sounds like a good father," Ronel said carefully. "He was," Evelyn replied, and now there were tears in her eyes. "He was the best father a girl could ask for. He used to say that hard work was its own reward, that as long as you could look at yourself in the mirror and be proud of what you'd accomplished, nothing else mattered." "What happened to him?" "Industrial accident," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "He was working overtime at a chemical plant, trying to save up money for my college tuition. There was an explosion in the section he was maintaining. 5 workers died, including him. I was 17. Ronel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. "I'm sorry," he said, meaning it. "That must have been devastating." "The worst part wasn't losing him," Evelyn continued, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "The worst part was finding out afterwards that the plant owners knew about safety violations. They'd been cutting corners on maintenance, ignoring federal regulations, all to save money. My father died because someone in a boardroom decided that profit margins were more important than worker safety." The pieces were starting to fall into place, Ronel. "So you decided to be the one in the boardroom, to make sure you were never powerless again." "Exactly," Evelyn nodded. "I used his life insurance money and a scholarship to get through college, then business school. I was determined to accumulate enough wealth and power that no one could ever hurt me the way those executives hurt my father. But somewhere along the way, you became them," Ronel observed quietly. Evelyn's face crumpled. "Yes," she whispered.
I became exactly what I'd sworn to fight against. And when I saw you, working so hard, caring so much about your daughter, being everything my father was, I couldn't stand the reminder of who I used to be, who I was supposed to be. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and painful. Ronel found himself recalibrating everything he thought he understood about Evelyn Cross. The ruthless executive wasn't just a heartless corporate machine. She was a frightened girl who'd lost everything and built walls so high she'd forgotten how to climb back down. "So, you fired me to avoid being reminded of your conscience," he said, not unkindly. "I fired you because seeing you every day was like looking in a mirror that showed me how far I'd fallen. It was selfish and cruel and unforgivable, but I couldn't handle the guilt anymore." Ronel was quiet for a long moment, processing this revelation. Part of him felt vindicated. His suspicion that the firing was personal rather than professional had been correct, but another part felt something unexpected, sympathy for the woman who'd destroyed his life. "What about you?" Evelyn asked. "You mentioned 20 years in maintenance work. That's a long time to stay in the same field. Did you always want to be a maintenance supervisor?" It was Ronel's turn to hesitate. There were parts of his story he'd never shared with anyone, wounds that had never fully healed. But if Evelyn could be honest about her past, maybe he could too. "I was going to be an engineer," he said finally. "Had a full scholarship to Georgia Tech, was going to study mechanical engineering. I wanted to design aircraft engines, maybe work for Boeing or Lockheed Martin."
"What happened?" "My girlfriend got pregnant our senior year of high school," Ronel said. "Sarah, we were both 18, thought we had everything figured out. My parents wanted me to give the baby up for adoption and go to college as planned. Her parents wanted the same thing. But Sarah, she wanted to keep the baby, and I couldn't abandon her." Evelyn listened without judgment, which made it easier for him to continue. "So I turned down the scholarship, got a job at a local manufacturing plant, and we got married right after graduation. I figured I'd work for a few years, save up money, and go back to school later." He laughed bitterly. Life had other plans. What happened to Sarah? Lily was born with her heart condition, and the medical bills were enormous. Sarah couldn't handle the stress, the constant hospital visits, the uncertainty. She left when Lily was 2 years old, signed away her parental rights, and moved to California. I haven't heard from her since. "So you've been raising Lily alone for 6 years, Evelyn said softly. 6 years as a single father, 16 years total, Ronel confirmed. The engineering degree became a pipe dream pretty quickly. I went to trade school instead, learned everything I could about mechanical systems and building maintenance. It's good work, honest work, and it pays enough to take care of Lily. Or it did, until last week." They sat in contemplative silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The storm outside seemed to be intensifying, if that was possible, and the warehouse walls creaked ominously under the pressure. "I never knew," Evelyn said eventually, "about your background, your dreams, any of it. I just saw your job title and assumed that I was just another blue-collar worker without ambition or intelligence," Ronel finished. "It's okay. Most people make that assumption." "No, it's not okay," Evelyn said firmly. "I made judgments about you based on prejudice and ignorance. I treated you as less than human, and that's inexcusable regardless of my own issues." "We've both made mistakes," Ronel said diplomatically. "The question is what we do about them now." Evelyn looked at him with something approaching hope in her eyes. "Is there a way to fix this? To make things right between us?" Before Ronel could answer, a tremendous crash echoed through the warehouse as something large struck the building's exterior wall. They both froze, listening to the sound of grinding metal and splintering wood. "What was that?" Evelyn asked, her face pale with renewed fear. Ronel was already moving toward the windows, peering out into the storm-lashed darkness. What he saw made his blood run cold. "We need to move," he said urgently. "Now. There's a crane that's been knocked over, and it's heading straight for this building. The construction crane was massive, easily 200 feet tall when upright, and now it was toppling through the storm like a giant's falling tree. Ronel grabbed Evelyn's hand and pulled her away from the windows just as the enormous steel structure crashed into the adjacent building, sending shockwaves through the ground that made their warehouse shake violently. "The basement!" Ronel shouted over the cacophony of twisted metal and shattering glass. "We need to get to the most structurally sound part of the building." They ran through the warehouse, dodging falling light fixtures and inventory that had been knocked loose by the impact. Behind them, they could hear the groaning of stressed metal as the crane's boom scraped along the side of their building, its weight dragging it inexorably toward the river of floodwater that had once been Fifth Avenue. The basement stairs were treacherous in the emergency lighting, and Ronel kept a firm grip on Evelyn's hand as they descended. The generator was still running, its steady rumble providing an oddly comforting contrast to the chaos above. They huddled together near the raised platform that housed the electrical equipment, listening to the storm rage overhead with renewed fury. "Is it over?" Evelyn asked, after several minutes of relative quiet. "I think so," Ronel replied, though he was listening carefully for any signs of further structural damage. "The crane missed us, but it was close. Too close." They waited another 10 minutes before venturing back upstairs, flashlights in hand to supplement the emergency lighting. The warehouse had sustained some damage, broken windows on the south side, scattered inventory, and a section of the roof that was now letting in rain. "We can't stay in the office area anymore," Ronel said, surveying the damage. Several windows had been blown out by the pressure wave from the crane's impact, and rain was driving through the openings with increasing intensity. "We need to find somewhere more protected." Working together, they relocated their supplies to a windowless storage room in the center of the building. It was smaller and less comfortable, but infinitely safer. Ronel rigged up some of the emergency lighting, while Evelyn organized their food and water supplies with the same methodical efficiency she probably applied to corporate logistics. "You know," she said as they settled into their new shelter, "this isn't exactly how I imagined spending my week." "Really?" Ronel replied, with the first hint of humor he'd shown since the crisis began. "Getting trapped in a warehouse during a hurricane with someone you recently fired wasn't on your calendar?" Evelyn actually laughed, a genuine sound of amusement that transformed her face completely. "Surprisingly, no. Though I have to admit, it's been more educational than most of my board meetings." They shared the last of the crackers they'd salvaged from the vending machines, washing them down with bottled water that tasted faintly of plastic but was infinitely precious under the circumstances. The storm outside showed no signs of abating, and the radio continued to broadcast warnings about catastrophic flooding and widespread power outages. "Can I ask you something?" Evelyn said as they listened to the latest emergency bulletin. "When you were pulling me out of that car earlier, why didn't you hesitate? Most people would have at least considered leaving me there, especially after what I'd done to you." Ronel thought about the question seriously. "Because that's not who I am," he said finally. "My father used to say that you judge a person's character not by how they treat people who can help them, but by how they treat people who can't. In that moment, you couldn't help yourself, and I was the only one who could. Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was," Ronel agreed. "Died when Lily was 4. Heart attack. Probably brought on by working too many double shifts trying to help us with the medical bills. Another good man who died because he cared more about his family than himself." The parallel to Evelyn's father wasn't lost on either of them. Two men from different backgrounds, both destroyed by systems that valued profit over people, both leaving behind children who had to find their own way in an unforgiving world. "I wish I could have met him," Evelyn said softly. "I think he and my father would have understood each other." "Probably," Ronel agreed. They both believed in doing the right thing, even when it cost them. They fell into a comfortable silence, each lost in memories of the fathers who had shaped their values in different ways. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, but inside their makeshift shelter, something warmer was developing. A connection based not on hierarchy or corporate politics,
but on shared understanding of loss and responsibility. "Tell me more about Lily," Evelyn said eventually. "What does she like to do when she's not dealing with medical appointments?" Ronel's face softened as he talked about his daughter. "She loves to read, goes through books faster than I can afford to buy them. The librarian at our local branch knows her by name and saves the new children's books for her. She's also fascinated by how things work, always asking questions about why the dishwasher makes that noise or how the refrigerator keeps things cold. Sounds like she inherited her father's mechanical aptitude," Evelyn observed. "Maybe," Ronel said with obvious pride. "She's certainly smart enough. Her teachers say she's reading at a high school level and she's only in 3rd grade. Sometimes I think about what she could accomplish if she didn't have to spend so much time in hospitals. What does she want to be when she grows up?" "Changes every week," Ronel laughed. "Last month it was a veterinarian, before that an astronaut. This week I think she wants to be a doctor, specifically a pediatric cardiologist. She says she wants to help other kids with heart problems." Evelyn was quiet for a moment, clearly moved by the image of a sick child who wanted to grow up to help others. "She sounds remarkable," she said finally. "She is," Ronel agreed. "She's the best thing I've ever done with my life." As if triggered by his words, his phone, miraculously still functional despite its earlier soaking, buzzed with an incoming text message. The cell towers must have been partially restored, allowing some communications to get through. The message was from Mrs. Patterson, his elderly neighbor who sometimes watched Lily when he had to work late. "Lily asking about you, safe at my sister's house in Brookfield. Hospital called about rescheduling surgery. Call when you can." Relief flooded through Ronel so powerfully that he had to sit down. "She's safe," he said, showing Evelyn the message. "My daughter is safe." "Thank God," Evelyn breathed, and Ronel could see genuine relief in her eyes. "You must have been terrified not knowing where she was." "Terrified doesn't begin to cover it," Ronel admitted. "Mrs. Patterson is good people, but Lily's never been through anything like this before. I've been imagining every possible worst-case scenario. But she's safe," Evelyn repeated, as if she needed to hear it again herself. "That's what matters." Ronel tried calling the number back, but the call wouldn't go through. The text had apparently used up whatever brief window of connectivity they'd had. Still, knowing that Lily was alive and safe felt like an enormous weight lifted from his shoulders. "The surgery rescheduling," Evelyn said carefully. "That's because of the insurance situation, isn't it?" Ronel nodded, the brief moment of relief tempered by the reminder of their ongoing crisis. "Without coverage, they can't proceed. The hospital has been trying to work with us, but there are limits to what they can do." "What if I—" Evelyn started to say, then stopped herself. "What if you what?" "What if I covered the surgery costs?" she said in a rush. "I could write a check tomorrow for the full amount. It would barely make a dent in my personal finances, and it would solve the immediate problem." Ronel looked at her carefully, trying to read her motivations. Is this guilt talking or genuine concern? "Both," Evelyn admitted. "I can't undo what I did to you, but I can at least make sure Lily gets the medical care she needs. No strings attached, no obligations, just one parent helping another."
"That's a very generous offer," Ronald said slowly. "But I'm not sure I can accept charity, even well-intentioned charity."
"It's not charity,"
Evelyn said firmly. "It's restitution. I damaged your family's financial security through my own selfishness and cowardice. This is me taking responsibility for the consequences of my actions." Ronald was quiet for a long moment, weighing pride against practicality. His daughter's life hung in the balance, and his own feelings about accepting help seemed less important than ensuring she got the surgery she needed. "Can I think about it?" he asked finally. "Of course," Evelyn replied. "But don't let pride put your daughter at risk. She didn't do anything wrong, and she shouldn't suffer because of my mistakes or your reluctance to accept help." Before Ronald could respond, the radio crackled with an update that caught both their attention. The storm's eye was apparently approaching the coast, which meant they might have a brief window of relative calm before the backside of the hurricane hit them with renewed force. How long do we have? Evelyn asked. Ronel was already moving toward their supplies, his mind shifting back into crisis management mode. Maybe an hour, maybe two. Long enough to assess our situation and maybe improve our shelter before the worst of it hits. What do we need to do? The question was simple, but it represented a fundamental shift in their relationship. Evelyn wasn't just asking for information, she was asking for instructions, accepting his leadership in their shared crisis. It was a level of trust and respect that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. We reinforce our shelter, check our supplies, and prepare for whatever the storm throws at us next. Together, Evelyn agreed. And for the first time since he'd pulled her from the floodwater, Ronald began to believe they might actually survive this ordeal and emerge from it as something more than strangers thrown together by circumstance. The eye of Hurricane Helena passed over Millfield just after midnight, bringing an eerie calm that felt more ominous than the howling winds that had preceded it. Ronald and Evelyn emerged from their reinforced shelter to survey the warehouse, using the temporary respite to check for new damage and improve their preparations for the storm's second act. The silence was unsettling after hours of relentless noise. Through the broken windows, they could see stars for the first time since the storm began, visible through the clear eye of the hurricane. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time, a reminder that they were literally in the center of one of nature's most powerful forces. "How long do we have?" Evelyn asked, helping Ronald secure loose materials that could become projectiles when the winds returned. "Maybe an hour," he replied, checking his watch. "The backside of the storm is usually worse than the front. We need to be ready." They worked efficiently together, their movements coordinated by shared purpose and growing trust. Evelyn followed Ronald's instructions without question, but she also offered suggestions based on her own observations. She was learning to see their environment through his practical eyes, while he was beginning to appreciate her analytical approach to problem solving. As they reinforced their shelter with additional furniture and materials, Evelyn kept glancing at Ronald with an expression he couldn't quite read. Finally, she stopped working and turned to face him directly. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice tight with nervous energy. "Something about why I really fired you, and why this whole situation is more complicated than I've let on." Ronald set down the metal beam he'd been positioning and gave her his full attention. "I'm listening." Evelyn took a deep breath, clearly struggling with how to begin. "Do you remember about 3 months ago when there was that accident at the Grandview Hotel? The scaffolding collapsed during the renovation project." "Of course," Ronald replied. "One of the worst accidents in the company's history. 3 workers were seriously injured. Could have been much worse if the safety protocols hadn't been followed. Do you remember who spotted the structural weakness that caused the collapse? Who filed the report that prevented a complete catastrophe?" Ronald thought back to that day. It had been a routine safety inspection that had turned into something much more serious when he'd noticed stress fractures in the building's support structure that the contractors had missed. His quick action had led to an immediate evacuation and emergency repairs. "I filed that report," he said, slowly, beginning to sense where this was leading. "Yes, you did," Evelyn confirmed. "And do you know who the general contractor was on that project? Who was responsible for the faulty scaffolding installation that nearly killed those workers?" A cold feeling was spreading through Ronald's chest. "Tell me." "Brennan Construction," Evelyn said quietly. "Owned and operated by Robert Brennan, Tyler's father. My assistant Tyler, who's been with the company for 2 years, who I've been mentoring, She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, but Ronald understood. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. "You fired me to protect Tyler, because my safety report implicated his father's company in gross negligence." "It wasn't that simple," Evelyn said quickly, then stopped herself. "Actually, it was exactly that simple. The report you filed was thorough, detailed, and damning. It documented multiple safety violations, substandard materials, and corners cut to maximize profit. Robert Brennan's company was facing criminal charges, massive lawsuits, and complete financial ruin. As they should have been, Ronel said, his voice hard. Those workers could have died because of their negligence.
I know, Evelyn whispered. And you were right to file that report. It was honest, professional, and exactly what you were supposed to do. But Tyler came to me in tears, begging me to find a way to make the problem go away. His father was facing bankruptcy, criminal prosecution, the loss of everything he'd built over 30 years. Ronel stared at her in disbelief. So you decided to eliminate the witness. I told myself I was just removing a complication, Evelyn said, her voice barely audible. If you weren't an employee anymore, if you left the company voluntarily, then your report might carry less weight in court. I thought maybe I could give Tyler's father a chance to negotiate a settlement, avoid criminal charges, keep his family from losing everything. Voluntarily? Ronel's voice was rising with anger. You fired me. You destroyed my life and put my daughter's health at risk to help cover up criminal negligence. I know, Evelyn shouted back, tears streaming down her face. I know how terrible it was. I told myself I was helping a young man save his father, but really I was just too cowardly to make the hard choice. Tyler reminded me of myself at his age, desperate, scared, trying to protect the only family he had left. The revelation hit Ronel like a physical blow. Everything he'd thought he'd understood about his firing had been wrong. It wasn't corporate restructuring, it wasn't personal prejudice, it wasn't even arbitrary cruelty. It was something much worse, a calculated decision to sacrifice him and his family to protect someone else's. Those workers who were injured, do you know what happened to them? Evelyn nodded miserably. Marcus Rodriguez is still in physical therapy, may never walk normally again. James Sullivan lost 3 fingers on his left hand, had to retire early. David Kim has chronic back pain that requires constant medication. And Robert Brennan. The case was settled out of court for an undisclosed amount. No criminal charges were filed. Brennan Construction is still operating, still getting city contracts, still cutting corners to maximize profit. Ronel felt physically sick. His termination hadn't just cost him his job and his daughter's insurance. It had allowed dangerous, negligent contractors to continue operating, putting other workers at risk. Tyler knew about this. It wasn't a question. Tyler orchestrated it, Evelyn admitted. He came to me with a plan. He'd researched your personal situation, knew about Lily's medical needs, calculated exactly how much pressure you could handle before you'd be forced to stay quiet about the safety violations. He thought if you were struggling financially, you'd be more concerned about finding a new job than pursuing legal action against his father. Jesus Christ, Ronel breathed. That kid played you like a fiddle. He played us both, Evelyn said. But I'm the one who made the decision. I'm the one who destroyed an innocent man's life rather than stand up for what was right. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of this revelation settling between them. Outside, the wind was beginning to pick up again as the eye of the hurricane moved past them and the storm's back wall approached. There's more, Evelyn said quietly, over the rising wind. Tyler isn't his real name. He's actually Tyler Robert Brennan, Jr., Robert Brennan's son. He took a different last name when he applied for the job at Cross Industries, used his mother's maiden name to hide the connection. He infiltrated your company, Ronel said in amazement. Spent 2 years positioning himself to protect his father's business interests.
2 years of playing the role of an eager, ambitious young assistant while planning to manipulate me into destroying anyone who threatened his family's livelihood? And you never suspected? Never, Evelyn admitted. He was so good at the role. Earnest, hard-working, grateful for every opportunity. I saw him as the son I might have had if my life had gone differently. I wanted to mentor him, help him succeed, give him the kind of chances I'd never had at his age. While he was systematically undermining your company's integrity and using your emotions against you.
while he was proving that anyone could be corrupted if you pushed the right buttons and applied the right pressure, Evelyn corrected. And he was right. I let him turn me into exactly the kind of executive I'd always despised, someone who sacrificed innocent people to protect the powerful. The wind was howling again now, announcing that their brief respite was over. They needed to take shelter immediately or risk being caught in the open when the hurricane's back wall hit them with renewed fury. "We need to get inside," Ronel said, grabbing their supplies. "Ronel!" Evelyn called out as they headed toward their reinforced shelter. "Ronel, I know this doesn't change anything, and I know it doesn't excuse what I did, but I need you to know that firing you was the worst decision I've ever made in my life. Not because of the consequences for me, but because of what it cost you and Lily." "We'll talk about this more when we survive the night," Ronel replied, pulling her towards safety as the first violent gusts of the storm's second wave began to batter the warehouse. But as they huddled together in their makeshift shelter, both of them knew that everything had changed. The truth about Tyler's manipulation didn't excuse Evelyn's choices, but it did explain them. And more importantly, it revealed that their confrontation with each other had been orchestrated by someone who wanted to prove that decency and integrity were just illusions that would crumble under pressure. Whether he'd been right or wrong about that remained to be seen. The back wall of Hurricane Helena hit the warehouse with even more violence than the front, as if the storm was making up for the brief moment of calm it had allowed them. Inside their reinforced shelter, Ronel and Evelyn listened to the renewed fury outside while processing the devastating truth about Tyler's manipulation. "I need to understand something," Ronel said, his voice carefully controlled despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "When you were sitting in that office, making the decision to fire me, what was going through your mind? Not the corporate justifications or Tyler's manipulation. What were you actually thinking in that moment?" Evelyn was quiet for a long time, her face illuminated by the dim glow of their emergency lighting. When she finally spoke, her voice was raw with honesty. "I was thinking about how much easier my life would be if you just disappeared. Not just because of Tyler's pressure, but because seeing you every day forced me to confront how far I had fallen from who I used to be. You represented everything I had abandoned: integrity, dedication to family, willingness to sacrifice for others. Every time I saw you working late to make sure your daughter had what she needed, I was reminded of my father doing the same thing for me. So you decided to eliminate the reminder rather than change your behavior." "Exactly. It was cowardly and selfish, but in that moment it felt like self-preservation. I'd built my entire identity around being strong, independent, never needing anyone or anything. You made me feel weak and sentimental, and I hated that feeling." Ronel studied her face in the dim light, trying to reconcile this honest, vulnerable woman with the cold executive who had destroyed his life. And Tyler played on that weakness. Tyler understood exactly what buttons to push. He'd been watching me for 2 years, learning my insecurities and fears. He knew I'd been struggling with guilt about how ruthless I'd become, and he used that guilt against me. He made it seem like helping his father was a way to show mercy, to prove I still had a conscience, when really it was the opposite. When really it was the final step in my moral corruption. By the time I realized what I'd done, the damage was irreversible. You were gone, Tyler had what he wanted, and I was left knowing I'd become exactly what I had sworn never to be. The warehouse shuddered under another violent gust, reminding them both of the forces beyond their control. But the conversation felt more urgent than the storm, as if they both understood that survival wasn't just about making it through the hurricane, but about finding a way to live with the choices they had made. "The workers who were injured in that scaffolding collapse, you mentioned their names earlier. Marcus Rodriguez, James Sullivan, David Kim. Did you ever meet them?" Evelyn's face crumpled. "I met their families," she said quietly. "At the hospital, the day after the accident. Marcus's wife was pregnant with their second child. James had just taken out a second mortgage to pay for his daughter's wedding. David was 6 months away from retirement, planning to spend time with his grandchildren. And you knew all this when you fired me.
I knew all this when I chose to protect the man responsible for their suffering, Evelyn corrected. That's what makes it unforgivable. It wasn't ignorance or thoughtlessness. It was a deliberate choice to prioritize Tyler's family over the families that had already been destroyed. Ronel was quiet for a moment, his anger warring with something that might have been understanding. What happened to Tyler after I was fired? Did his plan work the way he hoped? Better than he could have imagined, Evelyn said with disgust. Without your report as evidence, the prosecutor's case fell apart. Robert Brennan's company settled the civil suits for a fraction of what they should have paid, and Tyler's father kept his business license. Tyler himself got a promotion to senior assistant with a salary increase and expanded responsibilities. And you let it happen. I facilitated it, Evelyn said. I rewarded the person who had manipulated me into betraying my own values. I made Tyler my right-hand man, gave him access to confidential information, trusted him with major decisions, all while he was probably laughing at how easily he'd corrupted me. When did you finally realize what he'd done? About a month ago, Evelyn admitted. I was reviewing personnel files for the quarterly board meeting when I noticed some inconsistencies in Tyler's employment application. The background check had been superficial, and when I dug deeper, I discovered the truth about his identity and his connection to Brennan Construction. So you've known for a month that you'd been played. I've known for a month that I'd made the worst decision of my life based on the manipulation of someone who saw me as nothing more than a useful tool, Evelyn confirmed. And I've been trying to figure out how to fix it ever since. Is that why you were still in the building when the hurricane hit? You were working late because you were trying to figure out how to undo the damage? Evelyn nodded slowly. I'd been meeting with lawyers, private investigators, anyone who might be able to help me find a way to reopen the case against Brennan Construction. I was also trying to figure out how to approach you, how to explain what had really happened, and see if there was any way to make things right. And Tyler knew about these meetings? Tyler knew everything, Evelyn said with bitter irony. He was scheduling my appointments, handling my correspondence, managing my calendar. He probably knew exactly what I was planning before I did. Which means he knew you were a threat to his father's business all over again. Which means this whole situation, being trapped here together, forced to depend on each other for survival, might not be as accidental as we thought. The implication hung in the air between them, chilling in its possibilities. Tyler had proven himself capable of long-term manipulation and strategic thinking. Was it possible that he'd somehow orchestrated their current predicament as well? You think Tyler wanted us trapped together in a life-threatening situation? Ronel asked. I think Tyler wanted to test whether his corruption of me was permanent. He wanted to see if I'd really changed or if I'd revert to my old patterns when faced with extreme circumstances. And what about me? What was he testing with me? Whether you'd save the woman who destroyed your life or let me die as punishment for what I'd done to you and Lily, Evelyn said. He was testing both our capacity for forgiveness and our commitment to our principles. Ronel thought about this possibility, remembering Tyler's strange behavior in the days leading up to the hurricane. The young man had been unusually insistent that Evelyn shouldn't evacuate, claiming that the storm would miss the city and that important business couldn't wait. He'd also made several comments about Ronel's character, questioning whether someone who'd been fired would really hold a grudge or if he was the type to help anyone in need. He was conducting an experiment, Ronel realized, using our lives as laboratory conditions to see if people really could change or if they'd always revert to their worst instincts under pressure. And we're still in the middle of that experiment, Evelyn said, because we haven't decided yet what we're going to do about Tyler, about his father's company, about the workers who are still suffering because of my choices. What do you want to do?
I want to expose everything, Evelyn said without hesitation. I want to reopen the investigation into Brennan Construction, provide evidence of Tyler's manipulation, and make sure that everyone involved faces appropriate consequences, including myself. Even if it means destroying your company's reputation, even if it means admitting publicly that you were corrupted by a 25-year-old assistant, especially if it means that. X-Cross Industries should be destroyed if it's built on corruption and cover-ups, and I should face consequences for my actions, regardless of how I was manipulated into making them. Ronel studied her face, looking for signs of the calculating executive who might be saying what he thought he wanted to hear. But he saw only genuine resolve, the kind of determination that came from someone who had hit rock bottom and decided to climb back up the hard way. The workers who were injured, they deserve justice, but reopening this case won't give Marcus Rodriguez back his ability to walk normally, or restore James Sullivan's missing fingers, or eliminate David Kim's chronic pain. No, Evelyn agreed, but it might prevent the same thing from happening to other workers on future job sites, and it might provide them with the financial compensation they should have received in the first place.
And Tyler? Tyler should face criminal charges for fraud, conspiracy, and whatever other laws he broke during his 2-year infiltration of my company, Evelyn said grimly. He turned corporate manipulation into an art form, and he did it all to protect a father who was willing to let workers die for profit. The storm outside seemed to be reaching a crescendo, with winds that sounded like freight trains and debris impacts that shook the entire building. But inside their shelter, a different kind of storm was finally beginning to calm. If we do this, Ronel said carefully, if we expose everything and pursue justice regardless of the personal cost, are you prepared for what that means? Prison time? Financial ruin? The destruction of everything you've built over the past 15 years? I'm prepared for whatever consequences come from telling the truth, Evelyn replied. I've spent too many years running from the person I used to be, and it nearly turned me into a monster. If facing justice is what it takes to find my way back to who I'm supposed to be, then that's a price I'm willing to pay. Ronel nodded slowly, recognizing the courage it took to make that commitment. Then when we get out of here, we do this together. We expose Tyler's manipulation, reopen the case against his father, and make sure everyone knows the truth about what happened. Together, Evelyn agreed. And for the first time since they'd been trapped in the warehouse, Ronel believed she meant it. Dawn broke over Millfield with an eerie orange glow filtering through the dissipating storm clouds. Hurricane Helena had finally exhausted her fury and moved inland, leaving behind a city transformed by wind and water. From their warehouse shelter, Ronel and Evelyn could hear the distant sound of helicopters, the first sign that rescue operations were beginning. They had survived the night, but both understood that their real test was just beginning. The radio's picking up emergency frequencies, Ronel reported, fine-tuning the battery-powered device they'd salvaged. Coast Guard, National Guard, emergency medical services. They're setting up evacuation zones and medical triage points. Any word on when they'll reach this area? Evelyn asked, helping him organize their meager possessions in preparation for rescue. Could be hours, could be days. They're prioritizing areas with known survivors and critical medical needs. Ronel looked at her seriously. We need to talk about what happens when we get out of here, about what we're going to do with everything we've discussed. Evelyn nodded, her expression resolute despite the exhaustion etched on her face. I've been thinking about that all night. The first thing I need to do is fire Tyler, properly this time, with documentation and legal justification. I also need to contact the district attorney's office and provide them with everything I know about his manipulation and his father's safety violations. That's going to destroy your company's reputation, Ronel pointed out. Cross Industries will be seen as either corrupt or incompetent, maybe both. Your board of directors will probably force you to resign." "Then they'll force me to resign," Evelyn said without hesitation. "I'd rather lose my position for doing the right thing than keep it by continuing to cover up the truth." Ronel studied her face, looking for any sign of doubt or calculation. Instead, he saw something he'd never expected to see in Evelyn: peace. The kind of peace that came from finally aligning your actions with your values, regardless of the cost. "What about Lily's surgery?" she asked quietly. "My offer to cover the expenses, does that still stand despite everything that's happened between us?" It was the question Ronel had been dreading, the one that forced him to confront his own pride and prejudices. Accepting help from Evelyn would solve his immediate crisis, but it would also create a debt he might never be able to repay. "I need to ask you something first," he said carefully. "If I accept your help with Lily's medical expenses, will you expect anything in return? Silence about Tyler's manipulation? Favorable testimony about your character? Any kind of quid pro arrangement?" "No," Evelyn replied immediately. "Nothing. No strings attached, no expectations, no obligations, beyond ensuring that your daughter gets the medical care she needs." "Why?" Ronel asked. "After everything that's happened, why are you still willing to help us?" Evelyn was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Because 15 years ago, a man named Arthur Sterling took in a scared, angry teenager who had nothing left to lose. He didn't do it because he expected anything in return. He did it because he believed that people deserved second chances, even when they hadn't earned them." She paused, looking out at the devastated cityscape visible through their broken windows. "Arthur gave me a chance to rebuild my life, and I repaid that kindness by becoming everything he would have despised. But maybe, by helping Lily, I can honor his memory in some small way. Maybe I can prove that his faith in human decency wasn't completely misplaced." Ronel felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the anger and resentment he'd carried since that devastating day in her office. "Arthur Sterling," he said slowly. "I've heard that name before. Wasn't he involved in workplace safety advocacy?" "He founded the Sterling Foundation for Worker Safety," Evelyn confirmed. "After my father died in that industrial accident, Arthur dedicated his life to preventing similar tragedies. He lobbied for stronger safety regulations, funded research into workplace hazards, and provided legal assistance to families of workers killed or injured on the job. And you inherited his foundation along with his company." "I did," Evelyn said with obvious shame. "And I've spent the last 5 years slowly dismantling everything he built. I told myself it was about efficiency and focus, but really it was about eliminating anything that reminded me of the person I used to be." The pieces were falling into place for Ronel, creating a picture of corruption that was even more tragic than he'd realized. Evelyn hadn't just betrayed her own values, she'd betrayed the memory of the man who had saved her life and taught her to care about others. "The Sterling Foundation," he said thoughtfully. "Could it be rebuilt, reformed to focus on the issues Arthur originally cared about?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if your penance isn't just exposing Tyler's manipulation and facing the consequences? What if it's about actively working to prevent other families from going through what Marcus Rodriguez, James Sullivan, and David Kim have experienced?" Evelyn's eyes lit up with something that might have been hope. "You're talking about reforming the foundation as a worker advocacy organization, using cross-industries resources to investigate safety violations, support injured workers, and hold negligent contractors accountable." "I'm talking about turning your company into what Arthur Sterling would have wanted it to be," Ronel clarified. "A force for protecting working families instead of exploiting them." "But I'd need someone to help me," Evelyn said slowly. "Someone who understands both the technical aspects of workplace safety and the human cost of corporate negligence. Someone who's experienced both sides of the power dynamic." "Are you offering me a job?" Ronel asked, though he thought he already knew the answer. I'm offering you a partnership, Evelyn corrected, not as an employee, but as a co-director of the reformed Sterling Foundation. Equal authority, equal responsibility, equal say in how we use our resources to help others. Ronel was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. It would mean working closely with the woman who had fired him, trusting her to honor commitments she might have made in the heat of crisis. But it would also mean having the resources and authority to prevent other families from experiencing what his had gone through. "What about Lily?" he asked. This kind of work would require travel, irregular hours, potentially dangerous situations, investigating workplace hazards. The foundation would provide full family benefits, including the best possible medical care for Lily, Evelyn said. And we'd structure the work so that you could prioritize her needs whenever necessary. No child should have to worry about their parents' job security, especially not a child dealing with serious medical issues. And Tyler, what happens to him in all this? Tyler faces the full legal consequences of his actions, Evelyn said firmly. Criminal charges, civil liability, whatever the law allows. And we make sure that everyone knows exactly what he did and why he did it. The sound of helicopters was getting closer, and Ronel could see uniformed figures moving through the distant streets. Their rescue was imminent, and with it would come the need to make final decisions about their future. "I need to think about your offer," he said honestly. "It's generous, maybe more generous than I deserve, but I want to make sure I'm accepting it for the right reasons." "Of course," Evelyn replied. "Take all the time you need. The offer will stand regardless of what you decide about working with me." "And if I say no to the partnership, but yes to the medical assistance?" "Then you say no to the partnership and yes to the medical assistance," Evelyn said simply. "They're separate issues. Lily's health isn't contingent on your professional decisions." A Coast Guard helicopter was circling their area now, its searchlight probing the flooded streets for survivors. Soon they would be rescued, returned to a world where their shared ordeal would become just a memory, and the normal rules of corporate hierarchy would reassert themselves. "There's something I need you to know," Ronel said, as they prepared to signal the rescue team. "Last night, when you were telling me about Tyler's manipulation and your father's death, I stopped seeing you as the person who fired me. I started seeing you as someone who'd been hurt and made terrible choices because of that hurt." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I forgive you," Ronel said simply. "Not because you've offered to help Lily, not because you've promised to make things right, but because you're genuinely trying to become the person you were meant to be. That's not something I can stay angry about." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, the first tears of relief rather than shame that she'd shed since their ordeal began. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm grateful for it." "We all deserve second chances," Ronel replied, echoing her earlier words about Arthur Sterling. "The question is what we do with them." The helicopter was landing now in the flooded parking lot outside their warehouse. Rescue workers were splashing toward their building, equipment in hand, ready to evacuate them to safety. As they gathered their few possessions and prepared to leave their makeshift shelter, both Ronel and Evelyn understood that they were about to re-enter a world that would test every commitment they'd made to each other and to themselves. "Ready?" Evelyn asked as the rescue workers reached their building. "Ready," Ronel confirmed, though he wasn't sure any amount of preparation could have equipped him for the strange turns his life had taken in the past 24 hours. Together, they walked toward their rescue and whatever uncertain future awaited them on the other side of Hurricane Helena's devastation. 3 months later, Ronel stood in the renovated offices of the Sterling Foundation for Worker Safety, watching 8-year-old Lily draw architectural sketches at a child-sized desk they'd installed near his workspace. Her surgery had been a complete success, and the doctors were amazed at how quickly she was recovering. The scar on her chest was already fading, and her energy levels were higher than they'd been since she was a toddler. "Daddy, look!" Lily said, holding up her latest creation, a detailed drawing of a construction site with workers wearing bright safety equipment and elaborate protective barriers around dangerous areas. "This is how buildings should be built so nobody gets hurt." "That's excellent, sweetheart," Ronel replied, studying her sketch with genuine admiration. At 8 years old, Lily had already absorbed more about workplace safety than many professional contractors. She'd become something of a mascot for the foundation, charming visitors with her questions about safety protocols and her uncanny ability to spot potential hazards in workplace photographs. "Mr. Rodriguez is here for his appointment," announced Sarah Chen, their new administrative coordinator. She was young, enthusiastic, and had come highly recommended by the worker advocacy groups they now partnered with. Marcus Rodriguez entered the office slowly, still using a cane 3 months after the scaffolding collapse that had changed his life. His wife Carmen walked beside him, carrying their 6-month-old daughter Isabella. The family had become one of the foundation's first major success stories. "Marcus, Carmen, how are you both doing?" Evelyn asked, emerging from her office with a warm smile that would have been unthinkable during her days as a ruthless CEO. She moved carefully to greet them, mindful of Marcus's mobility limitations. "Much better, thanks to you," Carmen replied, adjusting baby Isabella in her arms. "The new house is perfect, everything Marcus needs for accessibility, and close enough to the physical therapy center that we don't have to worry about transportation." The Sterling Foundation had purchased and renovated a home specifically for the Rodriguez family, equipped with wheelchair accessibility features and a therapy room where Marcus could continue his rehabilitation. It was one of dozens of similar projects they'd undertaken for families affected by workplace injuries. "How's the physical therapy going?" Ronel asked Marcus, who was settling into one of the comfortable chairs they'd selected specifically for visitors with mobility challenges. "Slow but steady," Marcus replied with determination. "The doctors say I may never walk completely normally, but I'm getting stronger every week. And the new job training program you set up is incredible. I never thought I'd have the chance to learn computer programming, but here I am, halfway through the certification course." The job retraining initiative was one of Evelyn's proudest accomplishments. Working with local colleges and technology companies, the foundation provided full scholarships and support services for injured workers who needed to transition to less physically demanding careers. "Any word on the Brennan construction case?" Carmen asked, her voice carrying the careful hope of someone who'd been disappointed by the legal system before. "Actually, yes," Evelyn said. "The district attorney called this morning. Tyler Brennan pled guilty to all charges: fraud, conspiracy, obstruction of justice. He'll serve a minimum of 3 years in federal prison, and he's agreed to testify against his father's company. And Robert Brennan, facing criminal charges for criminal negligence and safety violations," Ronel explained. "The new evidence we've gathered has reopened cases going back 5 years. It looks like the pattern of cutting corners and ignoring safety protocols was much more extensive than anyone realized. The investigation had revealed a systematic culture of negligence at Brennan Construction, with dozens of safety violations spanning multiple job sites. The foundation's team of investigators, led by Ronel and funded by Evelyn's resources, had uncovered evidence that would likely result in significant criminal penalties and civil liability. "What about the other families?" Marcus asked. "James Sullivan and David Kim." "James is doing well," Evelyn reported. "His prosthetic hand is working better than expected, and he started a consulting business helping other amputees adapt to workplace modifications. David retired early with a full pension settlement, and he's spending time with his grandchildren while his back heals." Both men had received substantial compensation packages from the foundation, along with ongoing medical care and support services. But more importantly, they'd become advocates themselves, working with the foundation to identify and prevent similar safety violations at other job sites. "Mrs. Cross," Carmen said, using the formal address despite Evelyn's repeated requests to be called by her first name, "I need to ask you something that's been bothering me." "Of course, what is it?" Carmen asked directly. "Why are you doing all this?" Carmen asked. "I mean, I understand that you feel responsible for what happened to Marcus and the others, but you could have just written a check and walked away. Instead, you've dedicated your life to this work. Why?" It was a question Evelyn had been asked dozens of times over the past 3 months by journalists, board members, former colleagues, and the families they were helping. Her answer had evolved as she'd come to better understand her own motivations. "Because I spent 15 years becoming someone I couldn't respect," she said honestly.
When I was your age, Carmen, I lost my father in an industrial accident very similar to what happened to Marcus. I promised myself that I would never let corporate greed hurt working families the way it hurt mine." She paused, looking at Lily, who had stopped drawing to listen to the conversation with the intense focus that children brought to adult discussions they found important. "But somewhere along the way, I forgot that promise. I became exactly what I'd sworn to fight against. Someone who valued profit over people, who saw workers as expendable resources rather than human beings with families and dreams." She met Carmen's eyes directly. "This work isn't charity for me. It's redemption. It's my chance to become the person my father would have been proud of."
"And it's working," Rondell added, speaking with the authority of someone who'd witnessed Evelyn's transformation firsthand. 3 months ago, the Sterling Foundation was essentially dormant. Today, we're investigating safety violations at 17 job sites, providing support to 43 injured workers and their families, and lobbying for stronger federal safety regulations. "The new whistleblower protection program is incredible," Marcus said with enthusiasm. "Workers are finally willing to report safety violations because they know the foundation will protect them from retaliation." The whistleblower program had been Rondell's innovation, drawing on his years of experience as a worker who'd seen safety violations go unreported because employees feared losing their jobs. The foundation now provided legal protection, financial support, and job placement assistance for workers who reported dangerous conditions. "Daddy," Lily interrupted, tugging on Rondell's sleeve, "can I show Mr. and Mrs. Rodriguez my picture of the safe construction site?" "Of course, sweetheart." Lily presented her drawing to the Rodriguez family with the solemnity of an architect presenting blueprints. "See, this is how they should build things, so nobody gets hurt like Mr. Rodriguez did. The workers have special clothes and helmets, and there are walls around the dangerous parts, and there are people whose only job is to make sure everyone is safe." Marcus studied the drawing with genuine interest. "This is very good, Lily. You've thought of everything. Proper scaffolding, safety barriers, protective equipment. Have you considered becoming a safety engineer when you grow up?" "What's a safety engineer?" Lily asked, her eyes lighting up with curiosity. "Someone who designs systems and procedures to keep workers safe. They work with architects and construction managers to make sure buildings are constructed without anyone getting hurt." "That sounds perfect," Lily exclaimed. "I want to do that. I want to make sure nobody's daddy ever gets hurt at work." The adults exchanged smiles, charmed by her enthusiasm, but also moved by the profound simplicity of her moral vision. In Lily's world, the solution to workplace injuries was obvious. You simply designed systems that prioritized human safety over everything else. "Speaking of the future," Evelyn said, turning to Rondell, "I have been meaning to talk to you about the expansion plans. The foundation has received inquiries from worker advocacy groups in 6 other states. They want to know if we'd be willing to help them set up similar programs." "That would require a significant increase in our budget and staff," Rondell observed, though his tone suggested he was already thinking through the logistics. "The budget isn't a problem," Evelyn assured him. "Cross Industries is more profitable than ever, partly because our reputation for ethical business practices is attracting clients who want to work with companies they can trust." It was true. The public revelation of Tyler's manipulation and Evelyn's subsequent transformation initially damaged Cross Industries' stock price and corporate relationships. But within weeks, the company had begun attracting new clients who valued transparency and ethical leadership. The hotel chain's occupancy rates had actually increased as travelers chose to stay with a company known for treating their workers well. "What about you?" Rondell asked. "Are you ready to take on that kind of expansion? It would mean traveling constantly, dealing with hostile corporate interests, probably facing legal challenges from companies that don't want their safety violations exposed." "I'm ready," Evelyn said without hesitation. "This is the work I was meant to do. It's what Arthur Sterling trained me for, even if it took me 15 years to figure that out." As the Rodriguez family prepared to leave, promising to return next week for Marcus's continued job training, Lily returned to her drawing table, but paused to look up at the adults. "Daddy," she said thoughtfully. "Yes, sweetheart?" "Are you happy now?"
It was such a simple question, but it cut to the heart of everything that had changed in their lives. 3 months ago, Ronel was a fired maintenance worker facing his daughter's medical crisis with no resources and no hope. Today, he was the co-director of a foundation that was making a real difference in the lives of working families across the region. "Yes, Lily," he said, looking around the office at the evidence of their work, case files representing families they'd helped, safety reports that had prevented accidents, photographs of workers whose lives had been changed by their advocacy. "I'm very happy now." "Good," Lily said with satisfaction, returning to her drawing. "Because you smile more now, and Miss Evelyn smiles too, and I think smiling is very important for grown-ups." Evelyn laughed, the genuine, unguarded laugh of someone who had found their way back to joy after years of corporate cynicism. "Lily's right," she said. "Smiling is very important for grown-ups. I'd forgotten that for a while, but I'm remembering now." As the afternoon sun streamed through the foundation's windows, illuminating Lily's drawings and the scattered case files of families they were helping, Ronel reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this point. A devastating hurricane had stripped away all the artificial barriers between them, corporate hierarchy, personal resentment, class differences, and revealed the fundamental truth that people needed each other. The woman who had fired him had become his partner in the most meaningful work of his life. The crisis that had threatened to destroy his family had instead given them resources and purpose beyond anything he'd ever imagined. And the daughter whose medical needs had once seemed like an insurmountable burden was now thriving in an environment where her curiosity and compassion were valued and nurtured.
Sometimes, Ronel thought, the storms that seemed most destructive were actually clearing the way for something better to grow. Hurricane Helena had torn apart their old lives, but it had also given them the chance to build something new, something based on truth, justice, and the radical idea that everyone deserved dignity and safety in their work. It was, he decided, a pretty good foundation on which to build a future. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.